much do you remember? How much do you remember? Temple under the mountain, lime tree in the shaft, gray robe on the edge of shadow, bare forearm dragging their branch across the flood. The river of stones, the sound of their shells clicking together. How much do you remember? Temple under the mountain, lime tree in a shaft of light, gray robe on the edge of shadow, forearm dragging a branch across the floor. River of stones, the sound of their shells clicking together. Cheap, but it would last a few hours. I backed into the corridors and began my descent. against the bell of pink light, and the air was already orange. On top of everything else, I was behind in my work. In those days, the Auric coast was coated with a thick film of overlapping micro-empires, petty kingdoms, experimental societies, agricultural collectives, nomadic bands, and other forms of human organization, too ephemeral to be contained by any terminology. The majority of these entities armed themselves with the usual array of symbol, sign, and anthem. The realm of Pisadian was no exception, and in my days of relevance, I worked directly under the High Marengo. For 7 years, I wove anthems of gilded synthesis and vast ambient cloud at the behest of the crown, performing far across this valley and the next for purposes of solace, sport, and war. But that was years and years ago. We all fade. My work had become clerical in nature, cataloging, analyzing, decoding the anthems, chants, and work songs of our hundreds of neighbors. In this capacity, I had memorized everything from the churning dances of Neomasilia to the piercing wail of Astoria, the plastic shining anthem of the Mouselands, the whispered hope songs of the mountain witches. So I was behind in my work. These were the days of bitter rivalry between Pisadian and Citadel, the High Marengo and High Priestess in constant skirmishes over scraps of the valley. The ziggurat employed weavers and singers, not only from the coast but from all across the rim, and I was barely able to keep up. Now I was thinking this encounter on the balcony, did it even happen? Yes, I could still feel the beat on the weaver within my robes. I was thinking it seemed more and more a trap, some commercean snare. It would not be the first time I had fallen under suspicion. Amid shifting tides of colleagues anticipating the next bell, I threaded my way through corridors and courtyards of marble out into the Marengo's garden. A green and violet iris in the Ojo of la Palacia, this garden contained the last living jacaranda trees on the coast. It was the middle of Sivan and they were in the full of their brightness, the ground thickly carpeted in purple and buzzing with sacred travelers. Stepping carefully to avoid them, looking down, I almost missed the clearing until I was at its edge and then stopped. At the center, in a column of salmon light, like Dimina, forth under the name High Marengo of Pisadian, motionless, naked, close-eyed under a sheer gold cloth. Upon the cloth crawled sacred travelers, at least 50, more than I had seen in this lifeline. It's difficult to think now, at the age of paper, when they numbered in the millions, when one might see 100 or 2 on any summer afternoon. In this garden, the travelers were named and numbered, carefully tracked. Each lived in its own glass, but their keeper was nowhere to be found. 3 of the Merengian guards stood on the far edge of the clearing, intently seeing nothing. I felt a pull. I felt it coming from beneath the ground. I felt the coldness in my tailbone and the heels of my feet, and the sense of forceful, patient inevitability. It was the pool of water source. I shifted back into the trees, sinking deeper into the soft earth with each step. The little travelers were everywhere. Their hum filled my ears. The sky was darkening, streaked with lavender, and the bell would soon be upon me. The gardens ran up against the southwestern gates of Pisadian. I was out and among the free buildings before the ring reached my ears. In those fractured days, the formal sovereignty and first layer powers of a petty realm like Pisadian would extend only so far as the physical walls of the Palacia itself. The majority of the valley's residents lived in freestanding apartment blocks and houses. Their allegiance to Pisadian, to Citadel, to Mouse, or to Rome, marked by a small shield affixed to the right side of the doorframe. This shield could be scanned, the level of one's allegiance determining everything from health care and conflict resolution to business rights and militia duties, to sources of one's water or light. Almost all the doors in my building bore the same crest on their shield as mine. The dark horse Forcenet of the Marengo, adorned with the rose of Pisadian. But when I reached my door, it was gone. I had recurring dreams in which I was struck by lightning. I would die, but I would not wake up. Changed, I would drift through a photo-negative world. In middle age, a watcher over the corner of the valley, my dreams were stalked by columns of smoke steadily encroaching, inexplicable formations of machines overhead. Now in old years, it was this cutting of lines that haunted my dream life. This sudden statelessness. Even though I dreamed of statelessness all throughout the age of paper, argued for it, pulled for it, this was different. Living in this sea of shifting states, they were no more a part of one's identity than what used to be called brand loyalty. In fact, they were the same thing. But in this valley of no particular consequence, there were only two, and they took and took back, block by block by block. This was not the desert nor the Vale of Joaquin. To be unlined in this place was death. I did not touch the door. The lights in the hallway were already dimming. Out on the street I stayed under leaf shadow, robes pulled close and matching the tone of the darkening air. Only then did I remember the paper, folded and curled in one of my pockets. I kept moving until I was south enough and west enough that I could slip to a small park far from sound and light. Unseen, hopefully unfelt, I threw myself beneath a young pepper tree and drew a circle around myself in the rich soil. The velvet sky was lowering itself onto all of us. I pulled the paper from my robe. It was an airline ticket, made not of paper after all, but a very thin plastic. A kind no one had seen for 40 years, and the two ports noted on the ticket were less than half an hour apart by car. Even in the days when flights existed, this flight did not exist. Even in the thin light of this moment, the aged ink, suddenly exposed, began to run. In spite of my care, my hands were soon smudged with indigo. Looking out from under the branches, I realized the ground had begun to tilt. Leaves and pebbles rolled down the street, followed by a pair of Commercian guard yelling and chasing after some lost piece of equipment. Then, nearly silent, and just against the edge of the park, a smooth and dark glass van, doors sliding open, driver unseen. A concentrated light shone suddenly on me, focused on the paper or on the stains on my hands or both. The pull, when it came, was around the wrists and gently on the back of the neck, and with a sense of urgent departure. This time I let it take me, found myself lowered gently into ancient cushioned seats. It felt as though the van never stopped moving during this process, and there was no sound of machine within it. Rather, I fell into it, and it fell down the street, along with everything else, as though the world had been wrapped into the shape of a funnel. Emotion was muted. The churning flows of life and death were distant, inaccessible. Somewhere inside the ancient walls of the van, an engine sputtered to life and the whole thing shook, only to come to a stop minutes later. The door was pulled open as if by human hands, but when I stepped out, there was no one. The nearest glass tower was identical to the others, except the door was open. The sigil 317-2A6 marked in clear script on the glass panel above. On my way to the entrance, I passed through a sort of courtyard. Benches on which no one had ever sat ringed around a sculpture. 3 arcing, unpainted pieces of metal spanned by a tensionless spring. Whatever feeling it might have held for its creator had been stripped. It stood now as a monument to non-meaning, a warning to all who passed. Inside, the age of the place filled my nostrils. Very little had changed inside this structure for nearly 100 years except for the accumulation of dust, as the automated filters died one by one. A low ceiling of dirty white squares, occasionally out of place, revealing darkness and clutter above. Outside and in the van, I had felt alone, but here, I was increasingly accompanied by some unseen presence. A group of figures walking just behind me in the periphery. Heavy, moving fast, burdened with gear. And then the feeling of a finger pressed hard into the center of my back. In this manner, I was escorted through warrens of cubicle walls, snaking cables, caved-in CRT monitors, all sporadically seen under distant flickering tube lights, past darkened conference rooms and up several broad staircases. It was in these kinds of places the secret work of the valley was done. While there were no longer custodians or air purifiers, the stilling remained in place. Sympathy and resonance felt dead here. Only ambition and bitterness were allowed through the sieve, in dull and muted form. Nothing could take hold or pull, and so tracking became difficult, remembering a near impossibility. The walls were covered with notes, details of the most insignificant kind. I looked down and my hands were still covered in ink. As we approached the glowing door, I was reminded of the other reasons secret work was done here. A large conference table was covered in devices shining under the blue light, portals to oceans of madness, full of the eyes of manufacturers and their rim states. Long since banned in the Valley realms and most of the rest of the coast besides, we had rendered them dysfunctional. If you tried to bring one within the walls of the Palacia, it would turn to ash in your hand. But in Subcontractor City, they still worked. One entire wall was covered in screen, all the imagery in shades of blue. The room was drowning. A dizzying succession of scenes overlapped. Singers of the mountain havens lost in their visions, faces twitching and fingers wrapped chaotically around their instruments. A spinning map of the city of Avalon and the Temple of Salt below. The famous scene of General Mia Marisol smashing through the fascist barricade on the Bridge of Mateo. The subject of thousands of murals and tapestries along the coast. Her column of delivery trucks converted into tanks, chariots, once even a dragon. The face of the general herself 15 years ago, and now in her exile. A diagram of the old grapevine wall, the coats of arms of realms and familias known and unknown, all colors stripped but shades of blue. I was so entranced by this wall of shifting images that I didn't see the shadowed figures seated around the table. As soon as I did, the wall went dark and the white tube lights in the ceiling shifted into their fullness. There were 12 others. I recognized the High Marengo, 2 of the Crown of Neomasilia, an ambassador from the collective of Joaquin, as well as one of their healers, surprisingly the High Priestess of Citadel. In the center of the table was a broad area cleared of all the devices. In the middle, an empty glass, a small jar holding a tiny sacred traveler, and a translucent pitcher filled halfway with a clear viscous fluid. Voices came from everywhere, but from none of them. Just want you to taste. From the centers of my feet through my fingertips, the pull was a creature of pure lines within me, a burning wire bent into the shape of my core, driving me as I poured the liquid into the glass and the glass into myself. A slow process, and then slower again. The lights began to fade. So did the presence of my observers. Only the little sacred traveler remained, buzzing in their jar until the droning of the wings became all there was of reality. myself a loose knot of vibrations held together by pure feeling, falling further apart. The spaces in between the fragments filled with petal and vine, fractal windows into possible worlds. And I could feel all those eyes in the room again, pouring through me, tracking branches, looking for patterns, faces, signs. Cloud formations over the Sea of Cortez. Marisol, a general again, older, returned from exile on the island of Catal. Page after page of flowing prophetic script from the thinkers under the rock of Moro. A vine, thick and implausible, growing on the outside of the bubble state, living on the glass and radiation beneath, uncuttable. The sign of 3 moons glowing deep beneath the waters of the Central Pacific, their light coming up from the depths and shining through wave after wave, flooding into the room. The table was empty except for an old coffee stain and broken telephone. The wall a loop of static. The corridors and rooms had filled with a pale gray light. Subcontractors sat at their terminals, eyes half closed, processing. The scratchings on the wall were no longer visible. In silence, amid a world of machines, I made my way out into the natural light. When I held up my hand, the sea of the ink remained. It was on fire.